Hey team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce's Ukraine War Frontline update for the 13th of January 2024. Please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Pause the video if you don't know what the lines on my map mean. Okay, let's go to the map and look at what is going on. You can see there's a couple of different coloured pins, which is good news for the Ukrainians in some areas and bad news for the Ukrainians in others. Let's go to the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, to see what they have to say concerning what is taking place in this northeastern axis. And actually, there's quite a bit to share with you from what they say. Kharkiv Oblast military administration head responded to a question about a recent reported 1.5 kilometer Ukrainian advance in the Kupiansk direction and stated that these reports are likely associated with Ukrainian forces recapturing previously lost positions. ISW has not observed confirmation of gains by the Ukrainians, but you can see here that Suryat Maps has some gains for the Ukrainians in this very northeastern area. Indeed, Suryat Maps, if we go back to look at that is here. In that Orlyansky area, we just say what they write. Situation northeastern front, Ukrainian army recaptured some positions south of Persho-Travnevi. Is that a 1.5 kilometer advance? Well, it could be in width if we sort of go to see how far that is. Well, that's 4.4 kilometers in width, as according to Gerard's pins there. Thanks to him for doing the mapping today. Whether that's a depth advance, I don't think it would be in that area, but they could well be making some advances. You can see some interesting defensive lines there for the Russians, as according to Andrew Perpetua, some change to that area that we've seen over the last few days. So things are happening around here, and it's not all going in the Russians' favour. They have found it pretty difficult to have any foothold in Sinkivka. They seem to be taken out by repeated I guess doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results by doing these repeated infantry-led assaults without apparently the use of much artillery. In fact, if we go to the ISW, that's what they talk about. So Ukrainian Ground Forces Commander Syrsky stated 150 to 300 Russian personnel serving in irregular Russian formations in Kupiansk and Liman directions conduct active actions each day, and these units primarily focus on breaking through Ukrainian defences. The Ukrainian spokesperson stated that Russian forces are preparing for another offensive effort near Sinkivka, where they renewed assaults in the past week and continue to accumulate forces, conduct rotations, and train units for future actions. This goes against what we've heard previously, that they do have enough troops in this area, or in general northern Luhansk area, to be able to conduct proper rotations, to rest, give their troops a bit of an R&R, which is not something that we hear very often with the Russians. Now, this is where it goes on to talk about artillery. There's quite a lot to go through here, but I think it is important. So a prominent Kremlin-affiliated Russian mill blogger expressed concern, so this is from a Russian source, about the Russian Western grouping of forces' ability to conduct effective offensive operations in the Kupiansk direction. The mill blogger claimed that Russian infantry with armoured vehicle support conducted assaults in columns in open areas near Sinkivka in December 2023. So that's what happened last month and has continued since then. These attacks on Sinkivka and with these columns of vehicles, and that Ukrainian artillery units and drone operators easily repelled these assaults by targeting advancing Russian columns. The mill blogger claimed that the elements of the Russian Western forces grouping of forces in the Kupiansk direction conduct only infantry-led frontal assaults and lack sufficient artillery support. And that's really crucial. You don't do big maneuvers without artillery to support you, not maybe as you're doing it, but softening the target before you do it. So absolutely hammer Sinkivka, for example, with artillery, multiple launch rockets, so on and so forth. And then as the Russian forces approach, you hang back on that artillery because you don't want to hit your own people. And then as these Ukrainian forces are picking up the pieces, coming out their foxholes or whatever, then the Russians are attack, and that's how you get your advantage. So it's about combining. That's why it's called combined arms maneuvers. You have that. You have air aviation strikes, you have artillery strikes, MLRS, and then the Russian forces kick in and ground forces and do their thing. Well, without that initial softening, then the ground forces go and do their thing, and the Ukrainians just sitting there ready for them, and they're pounding the Russians with their own artillery, with their own drones, and getting them caught up on minefields, and it just turns into an absolute disaster, and they end up retreating to only do the same thing the next time out. So, yeah, the Mill blogger claimed that such incompetence is systematic throughout the Russian Western grouping of forces, and compared the grouping to the Russian Dnipro grouping of forces, which Russian sources have routinely maligned as having serious command and coordination issues. So what's been going on in Krinky at the helm of Teplinsky is compared to the diabolical performance of the Russian forces in this northeastern sector as well, which is a prominent Russian mill blogger accepting that both areas are incompetent and are evidently taking huge losses. The Russian mill blogger's description of poorly designed and ineffective mechanized assaults across terrain with high visibility suggests that the Russian command has yet to internalize and disseminate lessons learned from failed mass mechanized assaults near Avdiivka in October 2023 to Russian forces throughout Ukraine, particularly across different military district and grouping of forces commands. This is really interesting. So, the Russians should be learning. They should be learning what happened, Well, you can go back, it's not even to October 2023. You can go back to 2022, whether it be, big columns operating elsewhere or they're trying to cross the Seversky Donetsk River and losing 100 vehicles, and then going down to Vuhledar and losing, 130 vehicles around there, doing exactly the same thing. And they haven't learned. They're like, oh, what should we do in Avdiivka? Oh, you know what will work? What we tried in Vuhledar. Yeah, but wasn't that like a massive failure? Yeah, but, it's a different time now, isn't it? It's Avdiivka, it's a different place. Try it again. Oh, it's even worse. Oh, brilliant. Let's try that in Sinkivka. You know what we did in Avdiivka and in Vuhledar and in trying to cross the Seversky Donetsk River? Oh, yeah, we lost like hundreds and hundreds of pieces of vehicle and thousands of troops. Yeah. Let's try that. But this time, you'll love this time in Sinkivka. Oh, right. Yeah, it might work because it begins with S. Yeah, exactly. And so the only conclusion you can derive from the evidence that we are seeing is that the Russians are not able to adequately learn and adapt in what they're doing. They are adapting in certain areas like drone usage and technology, but in terms of just on the battlefield tactics, there is an awful lot of doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. ISW previously assessed as of January, that's this year, that the Western grouping of forces appears to be relatively less degraded and better rested than other Russian force groupings and may therefore be better able to conduct an offensive effort than Russian forces elsewhere in Ukraine. So maybe they are getting rotations in that area. It remains unclear if the Russian Western grouping of forces will be able to conduct large-scale assault, to achieve operationally significant gains in a way that would be significantly more effective than the disorganized and costly Russian offensive operations that have been underway around Avdiivka since October 2023. However, the Russian Mail blogger's description of the grouping suggests that Russian forces in the Kupiansk direction may face similar difficulties during a possible intensified effort to capture Kupiansk. In other words, everything that's happened over the last few weeks, and indeed in light of the fact that it seems to be copying everything that's happened over the last few years, it doesn't look like Russia are realistically able to capture Kupiansk. And I would agree. Right, then we're going to come down. There's no changes to the mapping here, but just to let you know that there was some fairly substantial changes to the Terni area, and Surat Maps has that here. I'm just seeing it. That's still definitely, there's that little bit that pokes out there. which is there. Okay, so here we have a situation north of Donetsk. Recent video footage which shows the shelling of Ukrainian positions allows to correct the frontline east attorney, which shows some advances made by Russian army in the previous days never took place. However, as it was said previously, the front line is stabilized after the arrival of Ukrainian reinforcements. That is about the most explicit walk back I've ever heard Surat maps do. And nice to see them be maybe a little bit honest there with that, which is to say that, yeah, the Russians didn't make the advances that had previously been claimed. And we know that because the Russians are themselves shelling that area. Shelling of Ukrainian positions. It's on video, and it's, right within that this was all supposedly Russian controlled territory previously, and the Ukrainians being shelled here, and it doesn't appear that the Russians, the Ukrainians are being shelled here by the Russians, which means that the Russians aren't going to be all the way over there. Okay, and that's Surat maps admitting that they'd got that little bit wrong, I think. Anyway, we come further to Sad. No change there from the last 24 hours, but I just thought that was interesting to share with you. As for Bakhmut, nothing really to report in Bakhmut, which is, I guess, really good news for the Ukrainians. They want a quiet front line because that means that they are going to be under less pressure. Russians aren't going to be advancing. Of course, the weather will be playing a large part in what is going on, or indeed what is not going on the front line. So nothing really to report in Bakhmut. We'll come down to Avdiivka, where you can see there's some small gains for the Russians in the area around the water treatment plant. That is actually Andrew Perpetua aligning himself with Surat maps. So Surat maps first made that claim, then Deep State Map came along yesterday and agreed, and then Andrew Perpetua's caught up with confirming that the Russians are in control of that area around the water treatment plant. The ISW says quite a bit about here. It says geolocated footage published on January the 12th shows that Russian forces recently advanced just east of the Avdiivka coke plant in northeast-western Avdiivka. However, I couldn't find any evidence of that. So the three footnotes in that now no longer exist. So I think they've been taken down, which usually is the case if something's been badly dated or it's not correct. So that source, which I think was EJ Shahid or something, decent source that is been taken down. So I don't know that is true, that the Russians have therefore made geolocated advances east of the coke plant, unless that refers to this area by the water treatment plant. But usually they'll say the water treatment plant. So it could well be the claim of Russian advances here that is now being taken down, and so therefore it isn't the case. Anyway, I thought I'd just share that with you. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces advanced near the water treatment, so that's a separate place indicated here. So that first one won't have been referring to the water treatment plant area. Anyway, near the water treatment facilities of the coke plant area, a claim that is generally consistent with the available geolocated footage. In other words, the Russians have advanced in that area there. And then later on it says Ukrainian Tavrsk Group of Forces Commander Tarnavsky stated that there are high losses amongst foreigners and migrants fighting in the ranks of the Russian forces fighting in the Tavrsk direction due to poor training. That's an interesting observation there. I've been reporting a lot recently that the Russians have been trying to crypto mobilize by getting I call it klepto mobilization when I made a bit of a mistake in saying it, but actually it's a really good, I think, term to indicate this, to reflect this kind of going abroad, stealing people from prisons or bribing people and getting to fight your wars for you. That is what they seem to be doing, and the observation there is that they're also incurring fairly hefty casualties as a result. Right, now looking at the Marinka area, Surat Maps says that the Russian army made small advances northwest of Marinka, and that's indicated by Surat Maps' gains there, but I have to say that actually that's not quite on there. So JR has put the pin there, but we just need to change the line. So that's the Russians making, as I say, small advances Right, moving on, we are going to come to the south, and actually, as you can see, nothing really to report about from the ISW until you get down all the way to Robotyne and Verbove area. So we'll do that. We'll come past Velika Novosilka, Velika Novosilka, and come down to Robotyne, where all the mappers, so that's Syriac maps, Deep State map, and Andrew Perpetua showing some gains for the Russians. So less than in the tweet though, minor gains. So that's interesting. So they might have made that tweet and then changed their minds in the mapping. But anyway, there's some confusing narratives coming out of here that are saying different things. Like the Ukrainians, I think, are making some gains over here, as I reported yesterday. Russians making gains over here. But there were also claims yesterday that the Ukrainians were making gains somewhere around this area as well. So I don't know. It's maybe fairly dynamic. War Monitor says Ukrainian forces conducted a successful localized counterattack southwest of Robotyne, capturing several recently stormed areas. So that's what I was talking about, that kind of area. Here, Global War Monitor says the 65th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainians has conducted a small localized counterattack south of Robotyne and regained some Russian positions. Good news for them. Surat Maps here says that situation to the west of Verbove is that they have gained some there. So interestingly, we have, sorry, I was just getting myself a little bit confused. I was going to say something else, but I won't say it. Surat says that that the Russian army made small advances there. And then we have this is coming from the ISW actually. So the ISW says geolocated footage published on the 10th and 12th shows Russian forces capturing Ukrainian trench positions along the road west of Verbove. And the claim here is that a Russian assault group assaults a Ukrainian dugout west of Verbove, reportedly resulting in 5 Ukrainian deaths and 1 captured. And that is geolocated to this point here. So a little bit of success for the Russians in this area. But, we talk, it's just, that's exactly where that advance indicated by Surat Maps is. But again, we're talking about tree lines, about small, 5-person company being taken out there. I mean, it's not great, obviously, but we must remember that sometimes these gains are just in terms of a couple of men here and there and a tree line here or a dugout there. But anyway, it's not good news that the Russians are making some gains there in the Verbove area. Right, as we come out of the Zaporizhzhia area, we go down to the last section in the ISW, we can see that they say geolocated footage published on the 12th shows that Russian forces marginally advanced in eastern Krinky. So we go to the Krinky area, and eastern Krinky would be over in this area where we had some geolocations over the last few days indicating there's activity in this general area. I wonder if that's what the ISW are referred to, because they're usually a little bit behind, or at least they bring out their reports in the evening UK time, so late night UK time, when I then report this sometimes most of the day later on the next day. The information that they're referring to can therefore be a good 24 hours behind. At least it's not when they release a report, but when I report on their reporting, it ends up being a little bit behind. So we must remember that. Anyway, the geolocation is here. So this is a unit of the 501st, Separate Mechanized Brigade, 36th Marine Brigade. An FPV drone attacks Russian infantry, and an FPV drone also drops on them in the Krinky area. Let's go and find out where that is. Yeah, just checking that was a correct copy and paste. There's another digit in there. Yeah, so that is actually quite far to the east. That's not as worrying as it might have been had it been over here. If the Russians are in that position and being hit by FPV drones, it's not the end of the world. That is well behind their lines, as according to Surat Maps, and pretty much in line with their front line, as according to Andrew Perpetua. So, that's all okay, I guess. As far as what the ISW continues to say, positional fighting continues on the East Bank. A Ukrainian Southern Operational Command spokesperson Humaniuk stated on the 12th that Russian forces significantly reduced their pace of attacks on the East Bank in the past day. I don't know whether that is due to weather or some other variable. Right. So just to finish things off today for the Frontline update, that's what's happened. Good news for the Ukrainians in the Northeast. Slightly challenging in other places, but nothing really to worry about for either side. Just a kind of overall analysis here, which is in line with what I was saying yesterday, which is when you start looking or understanding these movements in a zoomed out fashion, and you understand that, well, actually, how long did it take to take Bakhmut? Over a year. And that's this area here. And actually, you know, if you work out how long it would therefore take Russia and how many troops they would have to expend in order to take lots of those Bakhmuts all around the east, it's going to take them a decade to even remotely get the Donbass back. And that's like their minimal desires. Really, they want to get to Transnistria and all the way over here. You need to take all of this land. Can the Russians do that? Well, no. I mean, they can barely take Bakhmut, and we're wondering whether they've got enough to take Chasiv Yar. I mean, we're talking about Mykolaiv, we're talking about oblasts here. So, yes, it's just not going to happen. Anyway, Military Lab kind of talks to this point. Russia's winter offensive, a massive failure so far, ? After 3 months, it seems that Russia's winter offensive is showing the first clear signs of stagnation, fatigue, and we can say that, at least temporarily, has run out of steam. I'm just going to publish my second video of the day. My videos take like an hour to upload at the moment because they're much bigger files because I've upped the quality, and that just means that everything is delayed on a daily basis. So apologies there. Anyway, to continue. No significant advances from the Russian side for the past 2 to 3 weeks. While as many Russian sources on Telegram admit, Ukrainians have begun to push them back in Kupiansk and Robotyne fronts after ousting them from the outskirts of Novomykhailivka on the Donetsk front during the previous week. In contrast, Ukraine's summer offensive, which took place during June to September, approximately 4 months, in 2023 was considered a huge failure by the Russian and Russo-neutral sources. But on the other hand, after 3 months of full-scale offensive, the Russians haven't completed their goal of taking Avdiivka yet, and the territorial gains made all over the front line are roughly no more than 30 to 40% of those made by Ukraine during 4 months of their offensive in summer 2023. This is really important. Like, if you're going to say, oh, the Ukrainian counteroffensive failed, then this counteroffensive has massively failed. And if you remember last year, I don't even remember this, when I was talking about the previous Russian offensive before the Ukrainian counteroffensive, so basically the Bakhmut attack and what they were trying up and down the front line, and talking about the deep battle doctrinal kind of strategy that they were using. Well, at the time, the Russians made very little gains, right? Bakhmut was their only real significant gains, right? And I had pro-Kremlin voices tell me very explicitly, yeah, but no one said this is actually an offensive. Like, it's not actually an offensive that the Russians were doing. Okay, so that's interesting. So you're saying that was an offensive, and we've had so going back to 2022, in August and November, we had the Ukrainian lightning counteroffensive in Kharkiv, and then the counteroffensive in Kherson. So you're saying that the last Russian offensive wasn't an offensive. Now, if you're going to come out and say, well, this isn't really an offensive either, like, if that's what any pro-Russians are going to say, they've got two options. One option is that this is a major Russian offensive, in which case it is empirically, as Military Lab says here, a failure. So this is a real dilemma for pro-Kremlin people in the threads, you know, your Matt Smiths or whoever it is in the threads that bang on about whatever and criticize. But actually, you need to look in a mirror here. So either the present Russian offensive is a failure, or it's not an offensive, in which case the Russians haven't been on an offensive since early summer 2022. What are they doing? They're the second greatest army in the world. So there are no options that make Russia look good. In other words, you have to admit Russian voice pro-Kremlin troll, you have to admit that the Russians have absolutely and embarrassingly failed to do any decent offensive maneuvers since they invaded in February, March, April 2022. When they got all the way to Kyiv and then were beaten back from there. When they got all the way to around Kharkiv and then retreated. Since then, what have the Russians done apart from taking Bakhmut and marginally advanced around Avdiivka? I think Military Lab here is on the money. How is Ukraine's offensive a huge failure, but the Russian offensive so far is being considered a success? I don't get it. And this is exactly what he's saying as well. I mean, this is a really good point. As he says later, it's quite obvious Russia has lost way more equipment in Avdiivka, but they have also more resources and they simply do not care about their men. So they constantly feed the meat grinder, hoping that they can find some cracks in the Ukrainian defense that they can exploit. I think we need to belabor this point because the narrative that the Russians try to control is one of Ukrainian failure. But the success of the Ukrainians is huge. The success is in the Russians not being able to fulfill their objectives. The Ukrainians have absolutely succeeded in stopping the Russians achieving anything since summer 2022 and probably before. Apart from Bakhmut, which I have subsequently claimed is a success for the Ukrainians, because although the Russians took Bakhmut, it has no tactical advantage for them, and it cost them dearly. The Russians were fixed in place, so they couldn't fight elsewhere, and they were retreated at a hugely bad ratio for them. And so that ended up, and I say that after the fact now, looking back at all the data. What has Russia achieved since really spring 2022? That is a success for the Ukrainians. Thank you very much. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.